Hello, my name is Cynthia Frasier Graves, and today I'm going to be presenting the work of a local author, John Forssen. John publishes in the Village magazine. You may have seen his work there. Today I'm going to read 3 of his pieces that he wrote in agreement with the terms of flash fiction, which means there can be no more than 1,000 words in the story. So I will begin with Dreams of Flight, 996 words. The first cup of coffee was always bitter, reheated as it was from the previous morning, but it was of no consequence. Randolph hardly noticed, at least not enough to bother brewing fresh, while there was still enough for most of a cup remaining in the pot. His mornings these days were like that, driven as much by force as habit, as preference. And the stale coffee that fit perfectly with the first cigarette, it too was stale, the longest among several partially smoked butts left from the night before in an ashtray on the kitchen counter. There was a bit of a tremor in his hand as he brought the cigarette to his lips, then to bite down, clamping the filter between his teeth and leaning into the blue flame of the stove to light it. The tremor had been troubling at first, heralding the start of some neurological nightmare, but soon enough, showing no progression, it became as worthy of indifference as the stale coffee, hardly to be noticed. It was early, the night sky still resolute. He might well have been walking in his sleep, a spectre, if you will, drifting silently, a bare smudge on the hours through which he passed. It may have been a simple melancholy, normal enough, which engulfed him, emerging unnoticed, more than likely much the way groundwater rises through an earthen floor, its arrival generally sensed long before it presents observable evidence, a sourness in the air, perhaps, or a clinging dampness. Thus it was with Rudolph. He had come gradually and unremarkably to this point in his life. He had simply run its course over these 70 years, made his way, as it were, to the edge of his known world, and he was waiting now, sails slack, for a shift in the wind. And what to do in the meantime? Such a question, but certainly, he thought, no more noteworthy or fraught with uncertainty than, say, the autumn light or flight of a butterfly. He, too, was approaching the last leg of a predetermined flight, but unassisted by instinct, he was pondering the best way to go about it. Down the street from his apartment, there was a convenience store where he did most of his shopping, a clear indication of his narrowing existence and how reduced his needs had become. Coffee, milk, an assortment of poorly wrapped sandwiches, and the occasional bottle of wine. Yes, Randolph lived alone, as he had done for many years. He could see the store from the narrow window by his kitchen table, the store and the people who frequented it. This one child in particular. He was tiny, undersized, Randolph suspected, but sturdy enough, pulling at his mother's outstretched hand, that she was forced to plant her feet with each step to keep him at her side. He understood the woman's growing frustration and was only mildly surprised when she reached with her free hand and smacked him on the back of the head. Actually, he had been expecting it. Still, the thing he felt most was the boy's persistent straining for release. What a spell that urge for freedom could cast on a young boy, especially a small young boy, one more apt to believe in superheroes than his larger contemporaries, who had never experienced the hollow fear he knew so well and the bitter taste of shame, or at least that's how he remembered it. As a child, Randolph had always been smaller than the life he was expected to lead, smaller even than the boy outside the convenience store. And as much as anything, perhaps more than anything, Randolph had wanted to fly, to escape, and he believed in his childish way that a combination of desire and dedication could be enough to lift him above the treetops. Thus, on one sun-filled morning, he fashioned a bath towel, cape-like, around his shoulders, and he secured the two corners at his neck with a stiff clip. Then he began to practice, jumping again and again from the low back steps outside the kitchen door, the same steps used by the milkman when he made his weekly deliveries. Progress was understandably slow, but his desire and dedication remained constant. So it was only a matter of time before he began to think that a greater challenge might be needed to prime his purpose. Also, when the milkman came around the next day, he took the time to listen to Randolph's plan without the slightest sign of a smirk. And when he laid a hand on Randolph's shoulder and wished him luck, his expression was Sunday solemn, the eyes of a true believer shimmering beneath the visor of his cap. It was the short flight from the roof of the chicken coop in his backyard, a drop of about 10 feet onto the hard-packed ground, that and the broken arm that put an end to Randolph's attempts at flight. Although the dream, the outrageous possibility of it, remained very much alive, even to this day, in the early darkness, where for a few moments he could sit with his eyes closed and feel the magic all over again. Damn, but that was a good day, he was thinking. His eyes open now and fixed on the convenience store. Even with the broken arm, that was a good day. He imagined himself sharing this story with a small boy straining at the end of his mother's outstretched arm, and he wondered if the boy might have his own dreams of flight. Oh, the recollection was so vivid, the heat of the rising sun, the promise of an endless sky, and that brief, hopeful moment, neither up nor down, the sheer audacity of it. Randolph got up from the table and poured the last of the day-old coffee into his cup, and he wondered for a fleeting moment if it might be worth one last try. So that is the end of Dreams of Flight. 996 words. Let me take a sip of water. We'll go on to flash fiction by John Forssen 2, The Cribbage Club. It was 11:45 precisely, and lunch was over. Preparations for dinner, 4:30 sharp, already underway. At times, it seemed as if the cooks were afraid one of the residents might die before experiencing the satisfaction of one last institutional meal. Heaven forbid, Cornelia muttered to herself as she left the dining room. In another world, another life, she would be just now sitting down to her morning coffee instead of fighting off the first ominous signs of reflux. She was on her way to play cribbage with the girls, Harriet, Francine, and, yes, Arthur. Poor Arthur, they called him. Such a delightful little man. He didn't mind at all being included as one of the girls. In fact, he rather enjoyed it. Said it reminded him, in a roundabout way, of how his mother, while he was still very much a child, thought nothing of bringing him with her into the common changing room at the local swimming club. She was divorced by then, an ugly, hard-fought affair, and she held on to Arthur despite the lucrative settlement as if he were her last earthly possession. Until he was old enough to wait alone at the end of the street for the school bus, he was at her side. How he enjoyed that story. Even now, some 80 years later, his eyes twinkled when he recalled his mother's response to one of the women complaining about his being there. "You think at his age he's the least bit interested?" she had replied, an unmistakable chill in her voice. And she was right, at least partially, for Arthur was not interested, not the least, he confided to the girls with a wink. He was fascinated. Indeed, he used the word spellbound. Cornelia sometimes wondered, idly of course, if there might have been the hint of a suggestion in that wink. Or maybe the wondering wasn't so idle, for it was lately occurring frequently enough to have become familiar, even comforting, that at her age there might yet be an opportunity for a shared warmth, intimacy. She was thinking that very thing as she made her way carefully down the carpeted corridor to the card room, her hands firmly fixed to the bar of her walker. For more than 60 years, her husband Chester had that warmth. The memory of it, if not the warmth itself, was still very much with her indeed. Indeed, there were times, drifting in and out of sleep, that she could actually feel his arms wrapped gently around her, feel the heat of his breath as he whispered in her ear. On occasion, she would wake, tears of joy and sorrow, mixing as the dream faded. He was a good deal larger than Arthur and different in so many ways. Still, she couldn't deny looking forward to Arthur's company each week, nor could she forget the one time, after a particularly close match, they had left Francine and Harriet in the dead hole, that he had given her a congratulatory hug and seemed for an instant on the verge of kissing her. It wouldn't have been more than a peck, she was sure, but she could not deny her disappointment at its not happening. It was plain to see, however, that Arthur's days were numbered. Just the look of him, the soft shades of gray making their way phantom-like into his complexion, the increasing effort for him to stay with the game. But that wasn't the reason they began calling him poor Arthur. Heavens no. What a waste that would have been. It was the manner of his arrival. Left on the doorstep was how he described it, carrying his own suitcase into the facility on that first day, in the rain no less, his children staying just long enough to be sure he had left nothing behind in the car. Of course, the girls, too, felt a certain level of abandonment in what they called their new lives. But that was natural enough. As Cornelia became fond of saying, familial neglect is one of the costs of purchased care. However, there was something especially poignant about Arthur's situation, like he was still that small child in the women's changing room, only this time without his mother. No one to hold on to, and almost in unison they had exclaimed, "Poor Arthur." The carpet had been freshly vacuumed that morning, the thick nap perfectly smooth now except for the tracks of Harriet's walker and the dull impression of Francine's sneakers. Absently, as Cornelia noted the signs of their passing, she looked about for the poke of Arthur's cane. He always came early and made a point of rising and pulling her chair out the moment she stepped into the room. "Ah, my fine partner," he would say as she sat, "I trust you're ready for a glorious afternoon," and he would press his hands gently on her shoulders as she pulled her chair to the table. The yearning in his voice was unmistakable. More than once she had caught Harriet and Francine rolling their eyes at each other. Sometimes they behaved like a couple of teenagers. But she didn't care. There was no need to set them straight. Chester would understand. He said as much in the days prior to his passing. His voice was always kind, but especially so on that occasion. "Please," he murmured, holding her hand, softly caressing her fingers. "Don't spend the rest of your life alone. Don't lock up that big, beautiful heart of yours." It was only then, on the strength of that memory, his words echoing somewhere in her heart, that she began to worry. Foolishly, she told herself. Nonetheless, she stopped halfway down the corridor and looked again, more closely for the poke of Arthur's cane. But it was a trail gone cold, except for the gentle sensation of his hands warm on her shoulders. And that would be the second, and we'll go on to the third. Sip of water. This one is 1,000 words, exactly. And it's called All the Time in the World. The mailboat would be leaving from the mainland in an hour. Through the fog The island appeared to Eleanor like a smudge on the horizon. If she managed to get away, it would be the first time since her recovery from the fall, a tiny mishap which could have happened to anyone. Eleanor truly believed that. The idea of a stroke, even a small one, was absurd, and she had no intention of letting her hovering children believe otherwise. She dressed slowly, but with deliberate purpose, wasting no movement. Normally, she would watch the sea from her window while she dressed. She and that vast water spoke often at this time of day, but she turned her back, allowing the autumn wind to go unnoticed as it rippled the dark water of the bay beyond the long slope of her yard. This was no time for distractions. The mailboat ran on a tight schedule. But it didn't happen to just anyone, did it? Her daughter Marina had declared, a whisper of exasperation creeping into her voice. It happened to my 90-year-old mother, who has no business trundling off by herself for a walk in the woods. They were having lunch in the cafeteria of the rehab facility at the time of this conversation. It was the day of her discharge, and Eleanor was doing her best to deny the need for a visiting nurse. She was making a case for independence, the most important thing in the world to her at this time in her life. Lord knows, I've lost everything else, she complained. Her words were soft, but spoken with such bitter conviction that a spot of mayonnaise rolled over her lip and clung there. When Marina leaned forward, her napkin poised to wipe the spot of mayonnaise away, Eleanor slapped peevishly at her hand. In that moment, in the space between the slap of the hand and the next spoken word, the island, Eleanor's girlhood refuge, came to mind. It drifted into view on the gently swirling currents of near forgotten memory, a long ago friend come to renew old ties and offer comfort. You think you can treat me like a child? Eleanor sniffed sullenly. And then, folding her napkin, she rose to leave. By the time they reached Eleanor's house, Marina had retreated somewhat on the visiting nurse, hoping to assuage her mother's pique over the mayonnaise, at least for the moment. Let's see how it goes, she said, offering a cautious smile. One or the other of us, there were two sisters and a brother, will check in on you from time to time. Eleanor knew that meant every day at the stroke of noon, the same time she was thinking correctly that the mailboat would pull away from the town dock each day. She smiled now as she adjusted her hair in the small mirror by her bureau. It was 11:15. Time was on her side. The image staring back at her mimicked the smile, but seemed, independent of Eleanor, to add a conspiratorial touch of mischief. Eleanor winked at her and turned toward the door, almost skipping when she left the house for the short walk to the town dock, where she could already hear the low chortling of the mailboat. The captain extended a hand as she approached and, with a wide grin, welcomed her aboard. They were old friends. It's been a while, Eleanor. Heard you were feeling poorly. I hope that's all behind you. You're certainly looking well. As it happens, Gus, I'm feeling fine. Fit's a fiddle, you could say, and before the snow flies, I plan to spend a day or two on the island. Gus looked past her, shifting his gaze slowly from right to left along the shore. Alone? He asked, his tone shaded with concern. When Eleanor only scowled, he cocked his head to one side and raised a defensive hand. No offense, Eleanor. I'm just surprised, is all, that the kids are letting you go out there alone. Last I heard, after the accident, they had you on a pretty short leash. Eleanor leaned forward, their cheeks almost touching, as if they were children on the edge of some devious plot. Now, we've known each other long enough to share a secret or two, she said. Let's have this be one of them. She grasped his hand and held it long enough to feel certain he had exacted a promise. After all, Gus, too, was up in his years. She had a right to expect a little loyalty. Right on schedule, Gus reversed away from the dock and swiveled round toward the scattering of islands just beyond the mouth of the bay. The clouds were low and thick. The fog persisted, and there was mist in the air. Eleanor took a seat on the engine compartment. She pulled her coat around her, and she raised her chin to the wind, where, as an aging aunt had told her years ago, she might best capture the flight of memories. Eyes closed then, she drifted back through the years, and like images on scattered scraps of film, the past popped and glittered around her. Ah, such a wonderful day, she thought, her independence regained. It would be good to do something special for Gus when they returned to the mainland. She was in her 18th summer on the island when the images started to intensify. All at once, the colors were almost too bright to look at, and the sun, despite the low clouds which blotted out the light, burned against her cheeks. She sensed then that she should call Gus to turn around and head back to the mainland, but the colors were so beautiful, and she felt in those critical last moments before the colors gave way to blinding white, like she had all the time in the world. I thank you for listening. Amen.